December 1940. London is dark, not symbolically, literally. Streetlights are dimmed, windows are shuttered. The city moves carefully beneath the threat of nightly air raids. Warehouses burn, homes disappear. And somewhere behind those blacked-out streets, a quieter crisis is unfolding, one that bombs cannot solve. Britain is running out of money. Not weapons, not courage, cash, gold. Credit, the ability to pay for the war that now defines its survival. Publicly, Britain still stands tall. It speaks of endurance, of resolve, of fighting on whatever the cost. Privately, its leaders confront a brutal arithmetic. Without outside financial help, the war effort cannot continue much longer. This is the moment when the fate of the British Empire begins to shift, long before the war is won, and far from the battlefield. To understand why this moment matters, we need to understand the scale of what Britain was trying to sustain. By 1939, Britain was not just a country at war. It was the center of a global system, an empire stretching across continents. Naval bases, trade routes, financial obligations. All of it had to be defended, supplied, and paid for simultaneously. War magnified every weakness. Britain imported much of what it needed to survive: food, oil, raw materials, weapons components. War disrupted trade. Shipping losses mounted. Insurance costs soared. And as the conflict expanded, Britain paid not only for its own defense, but for the wider struggle to hold back Axis power across multiple fronts. At first, Britain paid in cash. Gold reserves were shipped across oceans. Overseas assets were sold quietly. Investments accumulated over generations were liquidated to keep factories running and fleets moving. This was not temporary belt-tightening. It was asset liquidation on a historic scale. By 1940, the situation was becoming unsustainable. Britain's financial reserves were falling faster than expected. Imports were essential. Exports were constrained. The balance could not hold indefinitely. And unlike the First World War, there was no easy return to borrowing from global markets. Confidence was fragile. Risk was everywhere. Britain faced an unspoken dilemma. It could not win the war without help. But the only country capable of providing that help was the United States, a nation not yet at war, but increasingly central to the conflict's outcome. This is where the story becomes uncomfortable. The alliance that would later be remembered as natural, heroic, and inevitable was, at its foundation, transactional. Not cynical, but conditional. The United States had resources Britain desperately needed. Britain had leverage of a different kind: time, geography, and the reality that if it fell, the global balance would tilt catastrophically. In 1940, both sides understood this. American leaders watched Britain's struggle closely. They sympathized. They calculated. They debated how far to go without entering the war directly. And crucially, they recognized Britain's financial exhaustion. Britain could not simply ask for gifts. So a new arrangement took shape, one designed to look like support without appearing like surrender. It would later be remembered as a lifeline. And it was. But it was also the first major turning point in Britain's decline as a global power. Under this system, the United States would provide vast quantities of supplies, ships, weapons, fuel, food, without immediate payment. In return, Britain would commit to future obligations, economic cooperation, and post-war arrangements that went far beyond the battlefield. At the time, this seemed reasonable, even generous. Britain survived because of it. But survival came at a price that was not fully understood in 1940. What began as wartime necessity would quietly reshape the rules of the global economy. Britain would remain in the fight, but it would no longer fight on its own terms. This is why the story matters. Because the British Empire did not collapse suddenly after the war. It unwound through agreements, debts, and decisions made under pressure. Decisions that traded immediate survival for long-term influence. The war did not destroy Britain's empire. The cost of winning it began to. And in the darkness of 1940, as London burned and the books no longer balanced, the first step toward that outcome was taken not in defeat, but in desperation. As Britain's war effort deepened, the financial reality grew harder to ignore. By 1941, the flow of resources crossing the Atlantic had become essential to Britain's survival. Ships arrived, loaded with food, fuel, aircraft, vehicles, and raw materials. Factories kept running. Naval patrols stayed at sea. The war effort held together, but nothing about this arrangement was free. Behind the public language of cooperation sat a complex structure of conditions, expectations, and quiet leverage. Britain was no longer paying in gold. It was paying in commitments, economic, strategic, and political. The system was carefully designed to avoid the appearance of debt. Supplies were provided without immediate cash payment. Officially, there was no price tag. Unofficially, there were understandings. Britain agreed to share technology, open markets, and align future trade policies. Its empire, once protected by preference and closed systems, began to open. This shift did not happen in public debates or dramatic announcements. It happened in memoranda, committees, and negotiations conducted under wartime urgency. Each concession felt manageable. Each agreement seemed temporary. Together, they added up to something permanent. American planners were already thinking beyond the war. They understood that conflict would end one day, and when it did, the global economic order would need rebuilding. The question was, who would set the rules? Britain, weakened and indebted, was no longer in a position to lead that process alone. This was the escalation phase. The wartime partnership expanded from military supply into economic planning. Discussions turned to currency stability, trade barriers, and post-war reconstruction. The language was cooperative. The implications were not equal. Britain's leaders were not blind to this. They knew that survival now meant compromise later. But the alternatives were worse. Without supplies, Britain would collapse militarily. Without endurance, there would be no post-war future at all. The choice was not between power and decline. It was between decline and defeat. So Britain chose survival. As the war intensified, Britain's dependence deepened. The empire still existed on maps, but its financial independence was slipping away. Decisions once made in London increasingly required consultation, coordination, and approval elsewhere. This dependency shaped strategy. Britain could no longer afford prolonged operations without assurance of continued support. Risk calculations changed. Long-term imperial priorities gave way to immediate wartime necessity. The empire became something to be managed, not expanded. At the same time, the United States grew accustomed to leadership. It controlled production. It controlled logistics. It controlled the tempo of supply. And with control came influence. Subtle, but decisive. This influence was not imposed by force. It emerged from imbalance. Britain needed the partnership more than the United States did. That fact shaped every negotiation, every compromise, every promise made for the future. By the later years of the war, the direction was clear. Britain would emerge victorious but not dominant. Its empire would still exist, but it would be financially constrained, politically exposed, and increasingly unsustainable in a world reshaped by American economic power. This was not betrayal. It was consequence. The wartime system that saved Britain also transformed it. The cost was deferred, not erased. And when the war ended, the bill would come due. Because empires built on credit rarely survive the moment when repayment begins. And Britain, still fighting for survival, was already trading away the foundations of the world it once ruled, one agreement at a time. The breaking point did not come with victory. It came with the bill. By 1945, Britain had survived the war, but only just. Its cities were damaged, its population exhausted, and its finances in ruins. The empire still existed on paper, but the system that sustained it was no longer viable. Years of total war had drained Britain's reserves. Overseas investments were gone. Gold had been spent. Exports lagged behind imports. And the flow of wartime support that had kept the economy alive was about to end. This was the moment when the contradiction became unavoidable. Britain had fought as a great power, but it emerged as a debtor. The transition from wartime cooperation to peacetime reality was abrupt. Supplies that had once arrived as part of a shared struggle now required payment. Reconstruction demanded capital Britain did not have. And global markets no longer viewed London as the financial center of the world. That role had shifted. The United States emerged from the war economically strengthened. Its industry was intact. Its reserves were vast. Its currency was stable. It was now the anchor of the global financial system, and it intended to shape the post-war order accordingly. Britain faced a stark choice. It could attempt to preserve its imperial system through emergency measures, controls, and austerity, or it could accept external assistance under terms that would limit its freedom of action. Once again, survival dictated the decision. Britain sought post-war loans to stabilize its economy, finance reconstruction, and prevent immediate collapse. The support was granted, but not without conditions. Trade preferences that had once protected the empire were dismantled. Currency controls were reshaped. Markets were opened. The imperial economic model was quietly dismantled. These were not symbolic changes. They struck at the heart of Britain's global position. The empire had relied on protected trade, controlled finance, and the ability to direct resources across territories. That system could not survive in an open, dollar-dominated world. The consequences were swift. Sterling came under pressure. Financial crises followed. Britain struggled to balance domestic needs with imperial commitments. Maintaining distant possessions required resources the state could no longer afford. This was the collapse phase. Not a dramatic end, a calculated retreat. Colonial holdings became liabilities rather than assets. Political control became expensive. Resistance grew. International tolerance for empire diminished. And Britain lacked the economic leverage to impose its will. Who benefited from this transformation was clear. The United States shaped the rules of global trade, finance, and reconstruction. Its currency became dominant. Its markets expanded. Its influence grew not through conquest, but through structure. Britain paid the price. It remained influential. It remained respected. But it was no longer central. The empire that had once defined global order now had to adjust to an order it did not control. This was not humiliation. It was arithmetic. The war had been won with borrowed power. And borrowed power always comes due. Britain's leaders understood this too late. They had assumed that victory would restore status. Instead, victory revealed limits. The real betrayal, if there was one, was not external. It was the belief that an empire could be saved by a system that no longer favored empires at all. And by the time that truth became clear, the foundations had already cracked beyond repair. The end of the war did not bring an ending for Britain's empire. It brought an accounting. Britain emerged from the conflict on the winning side, its flag still flying across vast territories. But victory masked a reality that could no longer be avoided. The empire Britain had fought to preserve was no longer economically sustainable in the world that followed. The war had changed everything. Britain's finances were exhausted. Its industrial base needed rebuilding. Its population demanded housing, jobs, and security after years of sacrifice. The state now faced obligations at home that directly competed with commitments abroad. The imperial system had once paid for itself through trade dominance, financial control, and privileged access to resources. After the war, those mechanisms no longer worked. Markets were open. Currencies were constrained. Capital was scarce. The economic tools that had sustained empire were gone. This is how the collapse unfolded, not through a single decision, but through necessity. Britain began to withdraw where costs outweighed benefits. Colonial administrations were scaled back. Military presence was reduced. Political transitions accelerated. What had once been a network of control became a series of managed exits. Each withdrawal was presented as a choice. In reality, it was a calculation. The empire was no longer an asset. It was a liability Britain could not afford. Maintaining control required money, manpower, and political capital that the state no longer possessed. This shift reshaped Britain's identity. For generations, power had flowed outward from London to the world. Now, power flowed inward. The priority became recovery, welfare, stability. Britain turned its focus from ruling abroad to rebuilding at home. The United States did not force this outcome, but it made it unavoidable. By anchoring the post-war economic system around its currency, its markets, and its institutions, the United States defined the terms of recovery. Those terms favored open trade, financial discipline, and economic integration, not imperial preference. Britain adapted because it had no alternative. This is the uncomfortable truth behind the wartime alliance. American support saved Britain from collapse during the war. Without it, defeat was likely. But that same support accelerated the end of Britain's global dominance by reshaping the economic environment in which empires could exist. This was not betrayal. It was transition. Power shifted from territorial control to economic structure, from empires to systems, from old hierarchies to new ones. Britain survived, but as a different kind of nation. The empire did not fall overnight. It unwound across decades. But its fate was sealed when survival required surrendering the economic independence that had sustained imperial rule. This story matters because it reveals how power really changes hands. Not always through conquest, not always through defeat. Sometimes, power is preserved in the short term only to be traded away in the long term. Britain's alliance saved its war effort. It cost its empire. And that contradiction sits at the heart of the modern world order. Because the collapse of the British Empire was not the result of losing a war, it was the result of winning one on terms it could no longer control.